Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
It's the biggest problem that human beings have ever wrestled with. The question of why we suffer if the one who made the universe in the first place is supposed to be good. That's our subject on today's episode of Authentic.
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
It occurs to me now that we're 30-some episodes into this show that it's probably time to have a little talk about theodicy, which is a $10 word for the problem of evil. And the problem of evil kind of runs like this. People say that God is perfect and that He is all-powerful and that He is love and that He's all those things at the same time. So you would think that God would be able to stop human suffering if He wanted to. In other words, the problem runs like this. We have a good God and a bad world, and you've got to wonder why. Any answer to that question is considered a theodicy, which amounts to a defense of God and His character. We get the word theodicy from an 18th century German philosopher by the name of Gottfried Leibniz, who went out of his way to defend the idea that the universe is ultimately a good place, in spite of what we might perceive it to be from our perspective. And you'll notice that somewhere underneath the question of a bad world and a good God, there's an implicit accusation that maybe there's something wrong with God. Of course, my atheist friends will insist that there's not just something wrong with God, but that there's something wrong with the idea of God. And to their way of thinking, the problem of evil probably proves that God doesn't exist at all. I'll give you an example of this kind of reasoning, one that I've read before on this show, probably more than once, because, well, this example is so blatant. It's the first one that comes to mind, and I guess I'm going to take the easy path here. Maybe one day I'll find some new quotes so you don't start thinking I've just read one book. But for the last time, perhaps, here's a statement from Richard Dawkins, everybody's favorite atheist whipping boy, because, well, he just makes this so easy. Here we go. An argument from an atheist that is really just a different version of the problem of evil. He writes, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it. A petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." Ha! End of quote. And I'm not sure I need to unpack that for you because what he's saying is pretty obvious. He's telling us, look, if God is real, then He can't be what people claim He is. He most certainly is not a God of love. And Dawkins is drawing from some admittedly difficult passages from the Old Testament. But what he's doing is cherry-picking the data to create the worst possible picture. He ignores the all-important context, the bigger picture provided by the other parts of the Bible. But for right now, it's important to notice that Dawkins is questioning the goodness of God in a world where very bad things happen. And the conclusion he wants you to draw is that God probably does not exist. For a lot of atheists, the argument kind of runs like this. Evil and the idea of a loving God are completely incompatible. And because evil exists, that probably means that God does not. The problem of evil is one of the most fundamental questions in philosophy, and it can lead to any number of disturbing conclusions. Some people will say that if God and evil both exist simultaneously, that would mean that God is either uncaring, which is not a great conclusion, or He's powerless to do anything about our condition, which is also not a great conclusion. Now, the other possibility is that God is just a figment of our imagination. He doesn't exist at all, which means that you and I might be utterly alone in this universe. And of course, that is also an unappealing conclusion. A conclusion that kind of defies this inborn sense that most of us have that there must be something else out there. The idea that we are nothing but accidents makes it hard to explain why we happen to be such complicated accidents with deep emotions and the ability to reflect on our own existence. The very phenomenon of human consciousness suggests that somehow mind existed before matter existed, because it's really hard to fathom how consciousness could emerge from mere physical particles. So, the idea that God doesn't exist really rubs most people's fur the wrong way. Unless, of course, you happen to suspect that your choices in life might require you to give an answer for what you've done. In which case, the idea of meeting God can seem very unappealing. But even then, I don't think that most people hope that God isn't real. I mean, there are a few out there, but not many. Most people hope that God is merciful, because who in the world wouldn't want a loving and merciful God? You know, years ago, I was working in the city of Rome, and I met this guy who was really interested in a seminar I was presenting over a number of weeks there in the city. And after getting to know him, we met for a friendly discussion. And at one point, he suddenly said, "Look, Shawn, I don't know how I can possibly accept what you've been talking about, because we don't even know if Jesus ever really existed." Now, very few people actually doubt the existence of a historical Jesus. They might argue that he was nothing but a popular countryside teacher, or they might argue that he simply died on a cross and never rose from the dead. But very few people doubt that he actually existed, because the mark he left on this world is just far too obvious. Even if you happen to believe that the stories in the New Testament are exaggerated, or that a lot of erroneous dogma has been piled on top of the story, few people doubt that Jesus was a real historical person. So, I decided I wasn't going to argue with my new friend, because I figured what he was saying was a bit of a dodge anyway, and it wasn't really the issue he was struggling with. So instead, I pointed to my Bible and I said, "Listen, let me just ask you one question. Do you hope what this book says is true, or do you hope that it isn't?" And he was quiet for a moment, and then he started to cry. He said, "I'd have to be a fool to hope that it wasn't true." And I guess I'm telling you that story to underline the point that most people don't hope that God isn't real. I mean, they might not like God, or at least the picture of God they were raised with, but when you actually see the narrative presented in the Scriptures, the story of a loving and merciful God who goes out of His way to save us, well, most of us want that to be true. And a lot of us are just really afraid that this wonderful story might not apply to us. Which brings us back to the problem of evil. One of the conclusions people come to when faced with the existence of evil in this world is that God does not exist. And as I've already said, that is not a happy conclusion. But the other possibilities, that God is powerless to deal with evil, or that He doesn't care, well, those aren't appealing either. So then what do we do with the idea of pain and suffering? How do we reconcile that idea with the loving and merciful God that Christians sing about in church? Well, I sincerely doubt that I'm going to be able to answer that question in just a few short minutes, because this is a question that philosophers have wrestled with for thousands of years. And most of the people who wrestle with it are a lot brighter than me. Now, I've seen some people suggest that this is the question behind all philosophy. People like Susan Neiman, whom I'm starting to suspect is probably right. I mean, if life on this world was paradise, we might still contemplate the meaning of life. But without suffering, you've got to wonder how much the question would actually bother us. Because there's something about suffering that really makes us wonder what in the world we're doing here. So, if the problem of evil is not the big question, there's no doubt it's one of the big ones. And in a moment, I'll be right back to look at this just a little bit more.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. Sign up at BibleStudies.com today and start your journey of discovery.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Near the beginning of the Enlightenment, there was this great deal of enthusiasm for the burgeoning art of scientific discovery. We began to suspect that maybe our human ingenuity and our capacity for reason could be used to tame the world we live in and solve many, if not most, of our biggest problems. And to a small extent, it's kind of been true. For example, I'm deeply appreciative of the extended lifespans that we seem to enjoy now. But then, of course, the senseless violence we witnessed in the 20th century kind of put the brakes on our optimism. Because when you have something like 200 million people dying from warfare in a single century, you start to realize that scientific discovery and technological advancement have only magnified our problems instead of solving them. It turns out there's something wrong with us. And until we can correct the human heart, the bigger problems just aren't going to go away. And of course, from a Christian perspective, that's really the issue. The suffering in this world doesn't stem from God, it comes from us. It's an indication that what the Bible suggests about our fall from grace is true. It says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But back in the early days of the Enlightenment, they were discussing an additional problem. Sin might explain some of the moral evil we experience, like murder, theft, or adultery. But then what do we do with natural evil like fires, floods, and earthquakes? How in the world do we account for that kind of suffering which is not caused by an act of the human will? What they were doing in the early years of the Enlightenment was trying to explain this in a way that preserved the idea of the biblical God. We often think that science and faith have always been radically opposed to each other, but that wasn't true in the beginning. The famous poet Alexander Pope kind of highlights what we thought we were doing when we started into the era of scientific discovery. Let me read you an epitaph that he wrote for Sir Isaac Newton, the man who gave us a much clearer picture of how the universe works when he laid out the law of gravity. This epitaph from Pope reads like this: "Nature and nature's laws lay hid in night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." What Pope is saying is that God used Newton to reveal something more about himself to humanity, which was the prevailing attitude back in that day. Scientific discovery was going to help us understand more and more and more about God, and that knowledge would help us resolve some of our biggest questions. Every time a new scientific principle was discovered, it underlined the idea that we live in an orderly universe, where if you only have the right tools, you really can understand things, and maybe even understand the Creator. Today we're still excited by the idea of exploring the far reaches of outer space, an excitement that's reflected in our endless production of new Star Trek variants. And it's exciting to us because, who knows what we're going to find out there? And who knows what those discoveries are going to teach us about who or what we really are? Now, our generation doesn't think of this as a search for God, but people in the 17th and 18th centuries really did. Here's another example from Alexander Pope's famous poem, Essay on Man. He writes, "Observe how system into system runs, what other planets circle other suns, what varied being peoples every star, may tell why heaven made us as we are." What these people were hoping to do was learn more about God, which in turn would help us understand ourselves. Now that brings us to the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, the person who coined that word theodicy. In fact, the only book he wrote that was published during his lifetime was his work on the problem of evil. And in that book, he makes a couple of very interesting contributions to the overall discussion. He really digs into the idea that it must be possible to reconcile the loving attributes of God and the existence of suffering. And again, the problem these philosophers were working on kind of ran like this. If God is pure and holy, and He's also the creator of everything, that would mean that He's also the creator of bad things, and that would make Him less than pure and holy. So what these people were trying to do was balance the moral universe and suggest that somehow all the good in the universe actually outweighed all the bad, and in the end, God's character will be vindicated. In other words, they were saying you and I just don't understand enough in order to comprehend the problem, at least not yet. Given enough time, Leibniz suggested, we will understand the problem because our scientific pursuits will help us see the universe as it really is. He even suggested that we don't have the right language to work on the problem, and until we do, we're not really going to understand anything. Leibniz speculated that once upon a time, before the Tower of Babel, human beings shared a universal language that was much more powerful and much more complete than the assortment of tongues that we speak today. If only we could devise a new universal language, he argued, one that allowed us to explore deep philosophical questions the same way we work on math problems, then we would finally understand that the overall condition of the universe is good. We simply lack the ability to see that right now. Now, here's the way he describes it in one of his essays. He says, "But no one has put forward a language or characteristic which embodies, at the same time, both the art of discovery and the art of judgment. That is, a language whose marks or characters perform the same task as arithmetic marks do for numbers and algebraic marks do for magnitudes considered abstractly. And yet, when God bestowed these two sciences on the human race, it seems that He wanted to suggest to us that a much greater secret lies hidden in our intellect, a secret of which these two sciences are but shadows." Now, Leibniz was kind of tapping into the world of medieval alchemy because he mentions the mystic Jacob Boehme in this same paragraph. The alchemists were big fans of Pythagoras, the Greek thinker who attached mystical meanings to geometry and numbers. But the basic idea here is still science. If we only had the right language, he argued, then we could finally understand the universe. And it's probably important to mention that Leibniz, along with Isaac Newton, invented a calculus, which is a mathematical way of measuring change. Some of you probably had to take calculus classes in school. So Leibniz was coming to the universe with the mind of a mathematician, hoping that we can use scientific language to open up the secrets of the universe. This, he suggested, would give us the ability to see that God really is good, and that we have been wrong when we give so much weight to the evil in this world. Scientific exploration would finally reveal that God really did create the best world possible. Now, I've got to take a really quick break because, well, that's how things work around here. But in a moment, I'll be right back to examine whether or not Leibniz was right from a scriptural point of view.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages. Your whole family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon. Check it out today at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
The German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz argued that God really did make the best possible universe, but that we're too limited in our understanding to grasp that. We just don't know enough. And here's where I really want to give Leibniz some credit, because in many ways the Bible kind of supports that argument. I'll give you a few examples. There's a statement over in the book of Romans where it tells us that human language is inadequate to describe some things. And that's where the mind of God begins to take over. This passage admits that something is wrong with this world, and then it tells us that we barely have the language to describe it. 8. It says, "For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now." So that's a description of the world we live in. And it's telling us that human sinfulness has not just caused the moral evil committed by individuals, but it has also led to natural evils. Because our rebellion has affected the whole of creation, turning it into something it never used to be. Paul continues by saying this, "Not only that, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. Likewise, the Spirit also helps in our weaknesses. For we do not know what we should pray for as we ought, but the Spirit Himself makes intercession for us with groanings which cannot be uttered. So there you have a number of elements that Leibniz believed in. Somehow, natural evil like fires, floods, and earthquakes, and the evil choices of human beings are connected. And you and I struggle to understand how and why that works. In fact, we barely have the language to pray about it. But are we really going to develop a new scientific language that makes up for this deficit of understanding? No, not in this lifetime. Not according to a famous passage in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Here's what he says. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. So again, he's admitting that human knowledge is very incomplete. He continues, but when that which is perfect has come, then that which is in part will be done away. So he's looking forward to a time when our knowledge will be more complete. He says, when I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. So now, as a mature believer, Paul is starting to understand things a little bit better. Not perfectly, but better. It goes on. For now we see in a mirror, dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know just as I also am known. What Paul is saying is that you and I only have a vague concept of what perfection actually looks like. And we won't understand the subject until the human race has been completely restored. So, according to the Bible, what Leibniz suspected is true, you and I simply do not have complete understanding. That same idea is reflected in what might be the most ancient book in the Bible, the book of Job, which is entirely dedicated to the problem of suffering and evil. For 37 chapters, Job and his friends are trying to figure out why Job has to suffer when he's always been devoted to the Creator. And when Job is done asking his questions, God shows up and begins to ask some questions of his own. Here's how that plays out now in Job 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? So in other words, God is saying, look, Job, you really don't have the tools you need to understand everything that happens in the universe. When this creation was first established, the sons of God, or the angels, shouted for joy. It was good. In fact, I declared it to be very good. And yes, it's different now. And now they're suffering. But you weren't there, and you don't really understand. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't any good answers. It just means that our human perspective is compromised by a lack of understanding. And it also means that God is going to help us understand one day, because Paul makes it clear that when we finally see God face to face, we will understand. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Voice of Prophecy's free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the prophetic mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and the world around you. You can study online or request them by mail. Visit BibleStudies.com and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Well, we're running out of time again, so it's probably a horrible idea to move into brand new territory. Yet I do want to point out that the Bible provides us with something that the Enlightenment philosophers did not. It provides us with a promise. I mean, Leibniz hinted at a promise. He hinted at a time when people would finally understand why we suffer. But he places that promise at the feet of rationality and science. The Bible takes a different approach. There are a number of scenes in the Scriptures that describe a final judgment that takes place in several phases. In Daniel 7, we see the angelic hosts assembling at the throne of God where the books of judgment are opened. And the question you probably need to ask is this: why would an all-knowing God need books? The answer is he doesn't. But a mere created angel might. You find the same thing over in Revelation 20, but with human beings instead of angels. It tells us we get to look at the books, which is another way of saying that we will eventually understand. Now, I know that argument doesn't make some people happy because we don't like to wait, and we don't like to think that we don't know enough to solve a problem. But there it is, and we're going to come back to this on another show. At that moment, the Bible says, God Himself will reach out and wipe away our tears. He will make us perfectly satisfied. Here's what it says in Revelation chapter 7. They shall neither hunger anymore, nor thirst anymore. The sun shall not strike them, nor any heat. For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to living fountains of waters. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. In other words, it's not going to be like this forever. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get a better grasp of the subject right now, even if our understanding is incomplete. The rest of the Bible offers good answers to the problem of evil that would frankly blow your mind if you took the time to look at them. You know, Leibniz predicted that in the future, our understanding of God's goodness would grow. And during the very next century, a number of Christians really tackled this subject seriously. One of those 19th century Christian writers wrote about it in 1888, and she said this. Now, this is one of my favorite passages from Christian literature. It's such a thought-provoking statement that I thought I'd finish with it today. She wrote, "It is impossible to so explain the origin of sin as to give a reason for its existence. Yet enough may be understood concerning both the origin and the final disposition of sin to fully make manifest the justice and benevolence of God in all His dealings with evil. Nothing is more plainly taught in Scripture than that God was in no wise responsible for the entrance of sin, that there was no arbitrary withdrawal of divine grace, no deficiency in the divine government that gave occasion for the uprising of rebellion. Sin is an intruder for whose presence no reason can be given. It is mysterious, unaccountable. To excuse it is to defend it. Could excuse for it be found, or cause be shown for its existence, it would cease to be sin." Apparently, David Hume, the famous philosopher, came to the same conclusion. You can either recognize that evil exists, or you can explain it, but you can't do both. So I think I'm going to let you chew on that idea for this week. Evil is a problem you're not going to solve only by using human logic. Because if you could find a good reason for the existence of evil, well, it wouldn't still be evil. So maybe Leibniz was right. You and I don't have the philosophical language to describe the problem. But that doesn't mean there isn't an answer, because there is. We're just going to have to wait for God to fill in some of the blanks. Thanks for joining me this week. This has been Authentic. I'm Shawn Boonstra.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.